Hello guys and welcome to my channel. My name is David and this channel is gonna be all about bodybuilding and bringing you the best knowledge when it comes to building muscle. I'm not gonna lie, I am from Poland, so it's extremely hard to reach out to the people outside of my country. So if you are from United States or any country outside the Poland, please subscribe to my channel. Please share this to your friends and basically help me share this information with everyone who is interested in it. Also, if you are from Europe and you like to support my channel and myself, please use the code Olszewski at www.propeptidy.pl and order the best quality peptides. They are shipping it throughout Europe, so don't worry about it. And without further ado, let's get started.
So, hello everyone, and welcome to the podcast. It's been a while since I do one of this in English, but today I have a special guest, Dominick Mutascio. Hello, Dom.
David, thank you for having me on, man.
Since we were working together, everyone just bugging me just to invite you. Almost every week, I have at least one request for you. So I'm so happy that you finally have some time and we can just arrange this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to it as well.
Okay, today we're going to talk about, I call it building the perfect competitor, but it basically means what to do to be competitive as a bodybuilder. And today we're going to speak about like an average to 12 open guy. So let's say it's a guy who's weighed, I don't know, 100 to 120 kilo. So it's going to be probably like 220 to 280 pounds, something like that in English. And what to do. So put it into that perspective. So let's say that he's a decent guy and he just wanted to start working with you. So he is in a perfect shape to just start his off season. And let's say, for I don't know why, but for some reason, he don't have any diet, any training protocol, any PEDs protocol, any supplements protocol. What would you do with him first?
So the first thing, like I tell everyone this before you can make really like good recommendations, is to put them through like a thorough evaluation where I start gathering data to start learning as much as you can about that individual from every single spectrum, from their training. When did they start doing hypertrophy training? Were they an athlete in high school or college? Because then you could start pinpointing, when were they hitting slow and fast switch muscle fibers? Because you can tell from doing this for quite some time, you could look at an individual and tell, depending on the age that they're in, let's say someone that's in their 20s and they're able to achieve that hard, dense muscle, you usually can tell then how that individual is either training or if that person was potentially an athlete previously before getting into bodybuilding. So you put them through an evaluation, look at a bunch of different things, what their PED history is, what their previous diet, nutrition, training, and then start assessing everything with them, getting feedback. And then from there, usually you would build them a pretty baseline program. If their body fat's in a really good place, then you could typically just put them on a basic workout, non-workout menu, maybe on a larger muscle group, add in a little bit of extra carbohydrates on that day, and start them off on a base plan. And then over the first phase, which, the first 2 or 4 weeks, based on how that person is responding, then you could start manipulating things like accordingly from there.
Okay, what about the training? Because the training, I think, is the most important thing. The diet, if someone half-ass the diet, but he is working so damn hard on the gym, he's probably going to be fine. But if he is doing the top-notch diet and he just half-ass at training, it's probably going to be a screw-on. So what about the training? What do you like to do in the off season? Do you focus more on a volume, on intensity, or splitting into a cycles? Like, for example, 5 weeks on a volume, and then 5 weeks on a intensity or something like that?
So great question. And from all my years of experience doing this, 15 years being a dietitian and prepping people for more than 13, 14 years, this was something that I really started to see after I was like an elite coach for at least 4 or 5 years. After you have individuals that you've been working with for 3 or 4 years, and then you see them starting to hit certain plateaus, and then from there I would start assessing close, like they're training a lot closer, and then it all started to make sense to me, because training is one of the most overlooked things nowadays, because people just think it's all your diet, which the diet is very important, and all drugs, which the drugs come in on the bottom end of the priority list. But when it comes to training, the first things that I usually, my go-to is sticking with basic progressive overload. The basics usually work very well. And the way that it breaks down is every 2 weeks, usually when someone's in the heart of an off season, let's say if, like right now, I have a pretty good 212 guy. He's pretty good, but he lacks a little upper pec development. And there's certain focused body parts that we need to focus on. So what I do every week, like on his check-ins, I write down 4 key compound exercises. And for him, it was like an incline dumbbell press, a slight incline Smith machine press, and like 2 other compound movements. And then what I'll usually have them do is send me what they are doing on their top sets, the weight and the rep ranges that they're doing every week on these compound movements. And then what I'll do from there is set them with target weight and rep ranges that I want them to hit within 2 weeks. And I'll also have them send me a video of them performing these exercises to make sure the execution is good. And if I start noticing that person, that they're starting to hit plateaus where they can't get over a certain point performance-wise in the gym, what I'll usually do then on those particular exercises, if I'm noticing that, I'll go ahead and I'll put them on a lower volume rep scheme. So what happens with a lot of people is when we're in the gym, I would say that there's only maybe 4 sets per workout that are physically changing your physique. Everything that we're doing is leading up to these top balls to the wall set. And sometimes what a lot of people do that, really want to go in the gym and they want to, take everything till failure on those kind of build-up sets is taking away from those top sets, where those top sets are the ones that mean everything. So a lot of times if someone was doing, let's say, a training split of rep range where they were doing like, 15 reps, 12, 10, 8, a lot of times those first few reps will be too high in volume that it's taking away from those top sets, where I tell people, you really want your ATP to build back up so you could give it everything on those top sets. So then in those circumstances, I would take someone and have them do, let's say, instead if they were doing 4 or 5 sets regularly, have them do 6 or 7 sets, but the first 4 sets, have them only do 5 or 6 reps and slowly just increase the weight. And then on maybe set 4 or 5, do 1 set with a heavier weight, but for only like 3 or 4 reps, just so that your body can get the feel under that heavy weight. And then the last 2 sets are your balls to the wall set. I usually will tell people, if you need to, rest for 3 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes, that's okay. Because a lot of times if people rush into a set, they don't realize if they don't rest long enough, that's taking 1 or 2 reps out of the tank. But those 1 or 2 reps are the reps that are changing you in the gym. And then the last 2 working sets, I would have them do the heaviest weight that they could on the first working set, let's say for maybe 10 reps. And then the last set, I would have them go as heavy as they possibly can for about 8 reps. So that's pretty much the standardized like training approach, progressive overload. There's different splits that you can do. Like there's, 100 different ways you could skin a cat. You could do push-pull legs. That's where communication comes into place when you're talking to the individual to see, what they're feeling, that they're getting the best connection with, mind to muscle connection with. And then from there, it's just about all about beating your previous 2 weeks. And then if you're able to accomplish that and you're eating the right way the body adapts to an environment that it's not used to is it will put on new tissue. Now, there probably will become a point where their body will start to be a little beat up and they will start to hit a plateau. That's when you go ahead and you'll incorporate a deload phase. And I would say typically for someone that's enhanced, after about 5 weeks or so of hitting it hard, then you do a deload week, which I like doing those too. They serve a lot of benefit during that time frame. And sometimes you could even pull the food back a little bit for that week, increase insulin sensitivity, rejuvenate the body, and then start hitting it hard again.
Okay, seems great.
Yeah.
Okay, since you are a registered dietitian, this question is gonna be probably the gold one. What about the diet in the off season? Just because I am asked, just because there's a tendency to doing something called like a bulking. I don't like this idea, but do you think that lean bulk or a full-blown mass mode bulk is better? Just to put some good quality tissue on guys. This one you can answer for like two different person. One man who's actually a beginner, and the second one is going to be this competitor that we are talking about from the beginning. Okay.
So yeah, and I mean, I think that it's pretty much very similar in both circumstances. I don't ever think that people should be allowing their body fat to get over a certain range, regardless of who they are. I don't think that people should be getting, 40 something pounds over their stage weight. Because at the end of the day, if you're losing more than, a certain percentage of your body weight or, more than 45 pounds, you're going to be at risk of losing muscle tissue. And I've been doing this for quite some time and I've seen it done every way that you could imagine. And I promise you that you will see way better results when you're doing it and keeping your body fat in a certain range, and you're also not force feeding. That is one thing. If someone ever wants to come on here and argue with me about this, I will debate them till they're blue in the face. If you're getting to the point where you're like, man, I can't even get another bite of food down, and they're force feeding, eating food, that is a big, big mistake. When your body's doing that, it's telling you that for a reason. Then you need to start looking at certain things. Sometimes they may be insulin resistant, because if you're running higher blood sugar, you're not going to be hungry. There could be many other things going on where the body's at the most prime state to grow when you're metabolically in a good place where, you're hungry every 2 or 3 hours. That's why I preach so much the rebound phase after the show, because your body is so insulin sensitive after a show. As you can see, it soaks up everything like a sponge. So those are the best places to be at environment for growth. And that's why a lot of times when we're in a growing phase, sometimes the best way to jumpstart someone's growth is to actually do a mini cut so that you're in a place. And I tell people, I've told you this before too. I mean, you have a pretty fast metabolism naturally, but a lot of times when people go into these heavy growing phases, I like their body fat to be pretty lean so that we could be in a place that we could afford to put on a little bit of body fat in exchange for some extra tissue. If you're starting this phase already and your body fat's high, then, you're not really in a good position to really be in a major caloric surplus and accumulate even more body fat if you're starting off already with high levels of body fat.
Okay, great. That was the answer that I know I'm gonna get from you, but I wanted to everyone hear that.
Yeah.
Okay, and I have to ask first before I ask those next questions, just because this is something that everyone's just scratch their heads. How do you count your macros? Do you count from every source? For example, like protein sources, you counted them from every source or just like an animal source?
So good question. So like when I worked more in a clinical setting, I would be looking at and basing things more off of macros when you're working with regular individuals. But when you're dealing with hypertrophy-based athletes, we're dealing more with nutritional timing. So that's really what I look at in terms of the breakdowns. Yes, your macros, but a particular amount of macronutrients around different times of the day accordingly to what your activity level is going to be like for that day. And typically the main things that you're really looking at is carbohydrates, protein, and fats. And the way that we kind of like structure that would be all really based upon the individual. I mean, there's some basic rules of like principle, like, I would say a go-to pre-workout of mine would be doing something like a higher glycemic index carbohydrate, whether it's a cream of rice, jasmine rice, adding maybe 15 grams of fat, whether it's from avocado oil, nut butter, and then a lean protein source. And by adding the fats to that meal, you're essentially slowing the glycemic index down. And I tell people this all the time if they ever want to do a test. I tell them in your pre-workout meal, eat 75 grams of carbohydrates one day with no fats in it, and then go work out. Then another day, add 15 grams of fat to that meal and then go work out. And what you'll notice is once those intracellular triglycerides are loaded, it'll slow the glycemic index down, and those carbs will stick and hold a little bit longer than if you didn't put fats in it. And then after a workout, you want fast absorbing nutrients. Usually I like to put in, like, if it's an off season, a little bit of fruit, like pineapple, and then another fast absorbing carbohydrate and a low fat protein source after.
Okay, but I am not sure if I asked the question correctly, just because I wanted to set the tone for the next question, which is going to be how much protein for the kilograms or the pounds of the body weight. So we have to assess how we count them, because if you tell me 3 grams for kilo and it's all just based on the animal source, it's probably going to be like a 4. You know what I mean? Yeah.
So you're saying, like, if you were to ask me how many grams of protein, how many grams of carbohydrates, am I counting from vegetables and carbohydrates?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Exactly.
So no, I don't. If it's grams of protein, it would be grams of protein from an animal source.
Okay. And so how do you like to have your athletes on? Just remember, we talk about 212 open guy. How many grams for kilo or pound is going to be?
So good question. That usually is highly contingent, the way that I will do things, based on how much fats and carbohydrates they have. So for an example, a guy, let's say the guy that's getting on stage at 250 pounds, believe it or not, in their off season, I will have them on less protein than I would going into prep. Reason being is because when they're in their off season, they're consuming 600, 700 grams of carbohydrates, 75 grams of fat, whatever it may be. And then as they get into a contest preparation phase and we start slowly manipulating their food and bringing their food down, their carbs and fats, and tweaking them around, as we get closer to the show, we'll slowly scale the protein up as we play around with the other macronutrients. So that's typically how we would do that. And I will tell you, like, one of the biggest misconceptions is the amount of protein that people think that they really need to grow. The 4 biggest people I've ever worked with probably in my life, you'd be shocked about how much, protein that they were eating at certain points, which, wasn't much. And a lot of times people don't realize too, like, protein is very hard to digest too. At some point, at least once every 8 months, 6 or 8 months, I have people actually go through, sometimes, depending on what their blood work looks like, sometimes I will have them actually do a week where they eat very, very little protein. it's a pre-cleanse phase that I'll usually put them through, and I'll remove protein, and that's actually it's really good for your organs, and it's just good to give your body a little bit of a break from it every now and then.
So, but are you a high, middle, or low protein guy? Just because you told me you've been surprised how low you can go on your protein. For some, low, it's like a 3.5 grams per kilo, and high is like a 5 grams per kilo. I've heard like Kai for sometimes it's like over like a 700 grams of protein a day. So it's some guys are going crazy nuts on it. So this is why I just wanted the like a number you like to hit if someone obviously have a digestion on point. Just because if not, obviously you have to lower it.
So I would say like roughly in pounds, let's say, I would say anywhere from 1.2 to 1.5 grams of protein per pound of body weight. Let's just say.
So it's like a 3.5 grams, I think, per kilo. So it's a decent amount. It's decent amount.
I'll tell you right now. Say if someone was 250 pounds. Times that by if someone was like 250 pounds, probably about 350 grams of protein, let's just say about like the highest that around, give or take, depending on how low or high the fats and carbohydrates are, though.
Yeah. And for those who are just using a MyFitnessPal and all of this bullshit, it's going to be probably like 100 or 150 grams more if you counted it from the rice and stuff like that. So yeah. Remember about it. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, a guy that's like 250 pounds, like say if like on average, like if they were in prep, maybe about like 8 weeks out, then their protein's usually about 350 at the highest, about something like that, which isn't that much for a guy that's getting on stage at 250 pounds.
Yeah, it is typical. It's typical. I've heard the same from almost every coach. So this is something that's it's pretty normal for those who are doing it for the good reason and with like a good knowledge, and for those who just reading the PubMeds, it's crazy high and everything's gonna be shut down in toilet. But yeah, but you are not gonna flush the protein in your toilet. Don't worry about it, especially if you're training hard and especially if you're using the PEDs.
If you weren't absorbing your protein, you would literally just pee it out your butt.
Yeah.
If you weren't absorbing it. And that whole BS theory that your body can only absorb, I don't know, whatever it is, 30 grams, that's bullshit. It is. I mean, you could sit down and if you ate 150 grams of protein in one sitting, it may not be optimal, but it's not like your body is not absorbing it. That is totally false.
Yeah, of course. And you have to remember that your body is not only using the protein for the muscle building. It's everything. It's skin, nails, and other organs that need it. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
And then like someone that would be that size, like 250 pounds, if they were going up that high, like midway in prep, in their off season, they would probably be down around guy that's 250, maybe about 285 grams of protein, 290 grams of protein in the off season, just because their carbohydrates and fats are so much higher.
So tell me about the fat intake, just because the fat is something that's not many take to the accountant. It's like it's one macros that seems to not be important for some reason. I don't know why, but what do you think about the fats in the off season?
Okay, so like I can go on a huge rant about this too. So in terms of fats, and I'll tell you something about from doing this for a while and having a lot of the other top coaches that, you become friends with them. Every coach usually has like a slightly different approach. And one of like my really good friends, rest his soul, because he passed away. You might have known who he was Matt Porter.
Yeah, of course. I love Matt.
It was very, very
Watch
good.
every video he puts and reads every article and message boards topic he went on. Yeah.
Great, like one of my closest friends. And we obviously would talk all the time. And he was known for conditioning. He got his athletes peeled. And I would say he worked predominantly better too with guys that were either middleweights or lower. His diet approach, though, which, this is why me and him would kind of go back and forth about it. He would do a very low fat diet, very, very low fat, which, I understand what he's thinking in terms of going into a prep, that fats are the most calorically dense out of any macronutrient, yes. But people seem to forget, like, your entire endocrine system functions off of fats. Even the drugs that we are taking, 90% of all anabolic steroids function off of fats, your intracellular triglycerides, things like that. So like the way the drugs work, it's highly tentative based on the diet that you're on. So fats are probably one of the most important things that you could incorporate into a diet. You need different forms of fat. And, like, I'm trying to think in terms of like PEDs, the drugs that might not be fat soluble. I'm not sure if primobolan is, but pretty much most performance enhancing drugs are fat soluble. So when we're in prep and you do these different diets, let's say some of these other coaches that are doing really low fat diets, they may work temporarily, yes, but you're going to see long-term repercussions from it, where, you're going to run into potentially different hormonal issues. And it's just not the smartest way to go about things, both in prep or in the off season. So as you know, I'm a big believer of fats. When we're in prep, usually on the non-workout days, those are days that I'll usually jack up the fats pretty high and then pull down the carbohydrates a little lower, because carbohydrates, essentially, you're using those as fuel for your hypertrophy training and whatnot. And fats are going to aid recovery. And yeah, they're definitely a staple.
Just gonna briefly touch the subject of the sources of the fats, just because everyone knows that you supposedly lower your saturated fats in a diet, especially if you're using a lot of carbohydrates. What do you think about it?
That you should lower your saturated fats if you're using high carbohydrates.
Using like a MUFA and PUFA is probably going to be more suitable than just like animal source fats.
Yes, at times, like, you would want to add in, like, if your carbohydrates are higher, you would want to add in things like good oils, macadamia nut oil. That's probably one of my favorites, avocado oil. But you still want to get in animal fats too as well. Those are also building blocks, but it's also the type of animal fats. Saturated fat all the time, necessarily, like, the thing you really want to be careful of is trans fats and the animal sources that you are getting it from. For an example, if you take a piece of, let's say, grass-fed red meat, like sirloin, and you get another piece of red meat, or even whole eggs too, the ones that are truly grass-fed, that have been grass-fed also their entire lifespan, which you have to be careful about that now too. That's another gimmick. I don't know about in Poland, but here in the United States, what a lot of these major food distributors are doing is they're labeling a lot of the animal produce grass-fed, and they'll only really be feeding them grass-fed for a week before that they're slaughtered. So you have to be familiar with these things, because the entire, like, our entire food industry here, it's very, very corrupt. But the the type of fats that are in some of the other processed meats are all these hidden trans fats. And to be perfectly honest with you, and I've seen this firsthand over years of people, let's say, that consume high amounts of red meat in their off season. I'm not talking about just eating maybe 8 ounces of it a day. No, I'm talking about consuming maybe 4 meals that can have 8 to 9 ounces in each meal in their off season. If they're eating it from one of these shitty processed sources, I have seen people's calcium scores skyrocket from it. And I have a cardiologist that I speak to pretty frequently that he monitors a lot of bodybuilders here in the United States. And he said the main factor here, he said, yeah, of course, drugs don't help. But he said the main thing is all the trans fats that these guys are eating in their off season, that they're eating such high amounts of it that's what's leading to plaque buildup. And after it leads to plaque buildup, then it will solidify and their calcium score will go up and will start all these cardiovascular issues in the body.
Okay, so how do you assess the amount of fat per a person? If like a 1 gram per kilo, so let's say it's like a half gram per pound, it's a good place to be in the off season.
So when you say that, now rewinding back, because I thought of someone right now that I am working with that worked with a particular coach. He's a big name coach. I'm not going to name names, but he had this individual on extremely low fats for like 3 years. So in his case, I had to start him off much lower on fats than I would normally be able to start off someone on. So it also has a lot to do with what they were previously exposed to and what they were doing. And in this person's case, actually, I tried increasing his fats to even, he's about a 200-pound guy currently. And I tried even increasing his fats on certain days to like 60 grams or so, which isn't like an astronomical high amount. And I noticed that his digestion he started having digestive issues, even with taking certain digestive enzymes and lipase to help break it down. He still was having issues, and I could kind of see it in his body composition that because of the fats, they were slowing everything down so much that he was just ending up accumulating more and more body fat, opposed to someone else that I might have been working with for some time that they were able to handle them a lot easier than this particular individual.
And my 2 cents, it's gonna be before I just start working with you, I was on a much lower fat diet.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah, and since we've added some fats, I have to tell you that I start to feel a much better. And yes, on the mind, like a clarity of the mind was better, and the pump on a session, even though that was a contest prep, so you're not expecting a great pump if you are like a 4 weeks out, so it's not going to happen. But it was, you can like see that it made a difference. So for those who are on lower fat diet and they are stubborn to not add it, just try it. Try it for 4 weeks. If you're not like it, just switch to the low fat and destroy your health continually. But if you're gonna notice that you are feeling much better, just stick to it. It's really great for you.
Absolutely. No, it really is. And another thing too, I mean, you're a good example to use for this too. I mean, you could see even when you were in prep, we could give you 600, 700 grams of carbs. You would, if you had under 40 grams of fat, you'd spin right through, no matter how much carbohydrates you were taking in. Now, when you add fats to them, that slows the glycemic index down a little bit, where they'll actually stick. And usually what I like to do, like a basic, like even peaking protocol, before you do a heavy carb load, like the day before, usually, typically, we would do like a heavy fat load that day because, and I mean, this is all like clinically, like clinical data that you could look up that backs all of this, that if your intracellular triglycerides are loaded prior to a heavy carb load, those carbs are more likely to store as muscle glycogen opposed to when you are in prep, your body is just blowing through everything. So if you do a fat load prior to introducing heavy amounts of carbohydrates, and say on Wednesday you did a fat load, Thursday heavy carb load, and then Friday you kind of do more of a fat carb mix. That's like typically like the most basic, safest protocol to go with, to have someone with their glycogen stores like loaded for Saturday.
Yeah. Okay, so next question is gonna be, I don't know if it's actually worth it to ask, just because it's basically the answer is gonna be the rest. How many carbs? The rest. If you set up your fats and protein, it's probably gonna be the rest of your calorie intake. So person dependent, but I think that you're not counting the grams per kilo for carbs. Yes.
No, not really.
No one does that. Yeah. Okay. So move on to the next question.
Everyone's totally different. I have a men's physique guy. He's a pro. But if I showed you what he was eating, you would be like, why am I not getting to eat all of this? Like, but it's just his body is different. He's metabolically in a different place, and everyone's body is entirely different, you know? So, you know, when it comes to carbohydrate intake, it really all depends on the circumstance. You know, sometimes, like typically, yeah, on your rest days, you don't need as much carbohydrates on that day. Yes. However, a thing that I am a big advocate of is when you are in prep, when someone's body starts to get a little beat up and run down, I am a big advocate of, once I start to see that, if I need to do a metabolic reset, I'll actually tell them to take a rest day, pull the cardio out, and actually refeed them on a rest day that they're doing nothing on that day. But that's kind of a different circumstance for when you're in prep and the body is kind of getting beat up and you're starting to have some of those metabolic adaptations. Those are the times usually that you would introduce that.
Yeah, probably some people just cover their ears when you say it's on the prep, and tomorrow, even though they are in the middle of the off season, just gonna tell their coaches that they are beat up, so they are needed some carb loads on the rest day. But it's not working that way. Okay, so I'm not going to ask you about the rotation between the training and non-training days, just because you touch up on it already, that you like your guys to do this like a kind of rotation of the carbohydrates. So you bump up the fats in the rest days and lower the carbs, and reverse on the training days. So this is typical. So probably this is not worth it to waste the time to speak about it.
I will say
at least you have something to add
about two quick things about training. So in the off season, I'm more of an advocate of incorporating more rest days in the off season. I've actually found that one of the best training splits, I think, in the off season are like if you do 2 days on, 1 day off, 1 day on, 1 day off, and then repeat that cycle. That's probably one of the best in terms that I've seen for actual growth in the off season, is incorporating more rest days in the off season. As you get closer to the show, you can turn up the frequency a little bit more, but in the off season, recovery is definitely key.
Yeah, and that's funny, just because the guys just wanted to use the time for build some muscle, so they wanted to train sometimes twice a day. Coach, can we train twice a day? I have the time. Twice a day, please. Twice a day. It's going to be twice as much, so it's going to be twice as fast when it comes to building muscle. And there's no data on that, and there are no competitors that I could recall that do that on the off season and really build some muscle, other than Roman Fritz, but this is debatable. and maybe just in Compton, but he is doing it like for maybe 6 weeks after the contest prep, and he just told that he's training twice a day just to not get fat, just because he tends to eat crazy. So this is more like a prevention than building strategy. Yeah.
So no, I know of like Juan Morel used to train twice a day.
Oh, didn't know that.
But sometimes some of these guys that I've seen do it and seen it work, they would still be taking rest days frequently, like similar split to what I was saying, or 2 days on, 1 day off. But in the earlier in the day, he would do movements like abductors, adductors, and save the compound movements for later on, something like that.
Yeah, the Roman trains 6 times a day, 6 times a week, 2 times a day, and he is doing like a leg day on the morning and back, for example, in the evening. He's just a machine. He's just a machine.
Okay, my apologies for that.
Yeah, don't worry.
Yeah, no, it's all good. So, no, what I was saying about the training with like different people, because typically that would be insane to train like that twice a day. But I have noticed that there are some people where you're sticking in those progressive overload like guidelines, but some people are actually able to consistently get stronger, staying on a higher like rep scheme where they can break strength PRs and they're still training, doing reps of like 15, 12, 10, 8, and they're still getting stronger week after week. And I tell them, look, if it's not broken, don't try to fix it. If that is working and you are breaking into either those, new strength or rep PRs, like if someone say someone's trying to bring up their upper pecs and they're a focus exercise is incline dumbbell press, if they're doing 120s on, their second week for 8 reps or for say 6 reps, I'll tell them then try to get those 120s then over the next 2 weeks instead of 6 reps for 8 or 9. If they're still doing that and they're on high volume, then that's working for them. But most people though, they can't do that high a volume in those earlier sets because it's going to eventually take away from the top sets for most people, where they need to be on a lower volume rep scheme to be able to push and break over those plateaus. But it really just boils down to the individual.
Yeah, that's me for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so another dietitian question. What are the biggest mistakes diet-wise when it comes to the competitors on the off-season that you're noticed the most?
The biggest mistakes is people get usually too fat. I would say that's usually one of them. And I've had a lot of veteran competitors where I've kind of opened their eyes to that, where they're like, man, like, you don't think we should keep pushing food? Because after a while, you'll see this a lot of times, even if you take even if you're using something like insulin or in any phase, you'll see great results for like the first 4 or 5 weeks. And then you'll just start accumulating shit weight. It'll just be water weight and body fat. You're not accumulating tissue at that point. So from there, you need to reassess things and then potentially consider actually doing almost like a mini cut to kind of resensitize the body, your insulin sensitivity, and then you start pushing again. I would say that that's probably one of the biggest mistakes. And also another mistake too is when someone gets right into an off season, they start hitting it 100 miles an hour, whether it's with PEDs or it's with food. Like where, let's say if someone's PED schedule is set at something, you're better off once, depending on what the person was doing before, whether they were off or whatever. Once you start incorporating androgens, the body's going to get a good response to it the first few weeks. Then you could slowly start tapering things up, whether it's your food, your drugs, whatever that may be, opposed to where if you just throw everything at it in the beginning, you're going to be more likely to plateau if you do that than if you're slowly scaling things up.
Yeah, of course. It makes sense. Okay, so I'm not going to ask about the mini cuts then, just because you're incorporating it if it's needed. So we're At least you wanted to add something about the mini cuts.
100%, yes. So like a lot of times for open bodybuilders especially, they will get to a point in their off season too where they're at the point where now they're just accumulating shit weight, extra water weight, extra body fat. Not only that, but the first thing that usually starts to skew is their health markers start to take a shift. Their blood pressure starts to go up. They start feeling lethargic. Those are all signs right there that there are things that need to be changed. And at that point, then you'll go ahead and then I usually will put someone into a mini cutting phase. And one of the other things that I'm really big on is getting feedback in regards to someone's appetite. So between meals, and you know that I like to do this, I like to see how hungry they are between every meal. If I see that their appetite markers are not really high, and that their health markers are starting to skew a little bit and they're feeling really lethargic and they're just accumulating this shit weight, that's when we'll start to shift gears a little bit and start to focus on dieting down and doing like a mini cut for whatever it may be for 4 weeks or so and get them to the point where, you know, once I change their diet into a mini cut, after the first week, they'll start noticing their appetite markers are coming up. As their appetite markers are coming up, their body's becoming more insulin sensitive. They're dropping some of this water weight. And then after about 4 weeks of doing that, then their body's in a better place to be primed for another heavy push to start increasing the food.
Okay, great. What about the cheat meals in the off season? What do you think about it? Are these necessary or this is luxury for someone who just can? Or what do you think about it?
All right, if you want my honest opinion, like in terms of progress alone, okay, if you're in the off season and your diet is tailored the right way, they're really not that beneficial in the off season because you should have plenty of food in your diet where they're really not needed that often. Now, I'm a big advocate of, in order for the competitor to be the best that they can be, it has to be about balance. And it has to be something, the number one most important variable over anything that we are even speaking about right now is consistency. And it has to be something that they can realistically be consistent with. So you can have on a lot of my people's plans, like even yours and a lot of other people, I'll give them actually a whole half a day that they can kind of eat as they please. I'll tell them you can eat your first 3 meals and then you can eat as you please. But what I'll usually do the day after they have a refeed, let's say they do on Saturday night, they have a burger and fries 11:30 p.m. at night. I'll tell them the next day I want them to fast for 13 hours, do, you know, fast and cardio the next day. Because what's happening then is they're just oversaturating their glycogen stores. And then if they're then just go back to their regular off-season diet, that's when you start accumulating body fat. So the way that I go about the programming for 80% of the people I work with is usually the day after they have a refeed, they have some sort of notes that they'll follow. Some people, I'll have them do a 13-hour fast and actually remove a meal from their diet and slightly lower the carbs the next day to prevent the glycogen stores from being oversaturated. So I'll usually do that so that way they could still have a day a week that they could really enjoy themselves where it doesn't negatively impact them progress-wise.
Okay. Yeah, I know how it works, but I just have to ask for those who don't.
Now, in prep, I'll tell you, and I know actually one top European coach that does not believe in this under any circumstances. And he lost 1 or 2 good clients because of it. He's actually a very good coach, this guy, but he doesn't believe in cheat meals in prep usually at all. 16 weeks. Not only that, but there's a lot of other coaches too that do not believe in when you're carving someone up to not use any sort of dirty, undiet food, which I'll tell you, in most circumstances, I like to stay with, like, when you're carving someone up, peaking someone, with the foods that we're used to using. But I will tell you, in certain circumstances, that's just not ideal, because I have people that metabolically they're in a certain place and they have so much muscle tissue that the amount of clean food that they need to eat is such a high amount that a lot of times that just won't do it. And especially if you're using any sort of diuretics, a lot of times it's needed. And in prep now, I also believe that there are places and times where refeeds are definitely needed. I would say most people probably don't need them. But there are a lot of times where, in the circumstances we were speaking about before, where people they're running their bodies into the ground. Because when we're in prep, your body doesn't know that you're prepping for a bodybuilding show. It doesn't. Our bodies are going into survival mode because we're going through a long period of time where we're either in a caloric deficit, we're pounding cardio. So our bodies are thinking, what are you doing? Like, you need to survive. So it gets to a point where I've seen this before, where guys are doing, I had a guy that just did a national show and he showed me what he was doing: 2 hours of cardio a day, 75 grams of carbs a day, wasn't dropping. He was actually gaining weight. And I told him, I said, it's because your body right now, anything you're putting into it, your body's grabbing it, it's storing it, because it doesn't know when it's going to be getting a fuel source. So in those cases, you have to reset that person. And the only way sometimes to do it for certain people is to actually have them pull back their cardio, sometimes take a day or two off in the gym, and actually refeed them and start to kind of like reset their metabolism to get them back into a fat burning zone.
Yeah, the contest prep is like a different animal. It's like a whole nother story. Just this is why we're gonna separate it from the off season, just to not mess up with the heads of some people, just because if they are lost in the translation, or just lost in their desire to have the cheat meals, they're gonna try to convince themselves that you just told to have unlimited amount of foods in the off season, and it's not what you told. So remember, this is like a prep thing. So it's you have to have that in mind. And the probably the cheat meals, even on the prep, it's only for those who glutes are actually striated already.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So what about a cardio in the off season? Do you like to do it fairly often, or do you think that cardio it is not the best tool for building a muscle?
Absolutely. It should be incorporated all year round, regardless of the phase that you're in. In the off season, obviously you're doing less cardio, but for cardiovascular purposes alone, it should definitely be. And usually the off season depends on the person. You know, it could be anywhere from 3 to 5, 20 to 25-minute sessions a week. It depends on the person. If the person's really lagging, like their legs are really lagging, you know, in the off season, we might have them do only maybe 3 sessions. I mean, I have a couple guys that only do 2 of them, 2 cardio sessions a week, but one of them I have them do like a hit window on one of the cardio sessions, which it's really just predominantly for them for cardiovascular purposes. And I don't care what anyone says, without a doubt, cardio is extremely important, just as important in the off season as it is in prep. You'll also be able to get more out of your training from the cardio, because you'll see that you'll gas out a lot quicker if you're not doing any sort of cardio.
The only people that's gonna be battle out with the what you say right now are the small ones who are actually not training hard. Just because if you are a fairly build up guy and you're training balls to the walls. Probably the cardio is what limits you from doing 25 reps heavy leg presses. So if you are not gasping for 15 minutes after the leg press, it's like it's cool thing actually to not feeling the blood in your lungs after the set. So if you feel the blood, you probably should do in your cardio a little bit more intense and build up on some cardio to be honest. Okay, and for the last three questions, we have the fun stuff for all those people who are waiting just to hear how many, much, and often they should pin and what they should pin. Just because for some reason, it's for some individuals, this is the most important thing. And everything we've just talked, it's not important at all. So PED use in the off-season. What are the best compounds for building mass in the off-season, in your opinion? And what are the caveats to not use some PEDs, for example, like tren in off-season and stuff like that?
So again, like this kind of breaks down to individual case. I know in the beginning of this, you said like how often, which a trendy thing I think that's been getting thrown around is like the whole microdosing thing. People microdosing their gear. I don't know, taking 32.8 milligrams of something.
Thank you.
I mean, I will tell you the truth with that. I have experimented with it with myself and hundreds of clients. The one main benefit that I do see with microdosing is that you need less aromatase inhibitors and anti-estrogens when you do microdose, which that is a big benefit when you look at the whole from a health perspective too, especially because when you nuke your estrogen, it's terrible on your lipid profiles, and it's just you want to try to minimize doing that. So that there is benefits in terms of like the microdosing. Now, when you go to set up someone's like PED protocol, that's usually when I like to see blood work. Okay, so the first things I'm looking for with that, I'll just give you an example. First things that we would look at when we're assessing lab work is, let's say someone's complete blood count markers. Especially ever since COVID came out, this is something that really needs to be looked at, because a lot of the people, the premature deaths that we've seen, and the thing is most people only hear about some of the top guys that this has happened to. This has happened to hundreds of people that are amateurs that we just don't know about because they don't have the presence that some of these other guys have. But what has happened is a lot of them had already slightly high complete blood count markers, and they would go ahead and then go on a certain cycle, say they were taking equipoise or something that's highly energetic, okay, that is going to increase your red blood cells. Now, when you combine that with already having slightly elevated complete blood count markers, and then take something like COVID, okay, or even the vaccine, that elevates something called cytokines in your blood, which are inflammatory markers, okay? And when those are elevated and you combine all three of those variables, you're at an extremely high risk of a blood clot. And I've seen so many people end up, unfortunately, getting these over the last 3 years, where I tell people too, like when it comes to the PED stuff, I tell them, look, they are doing this fully at their own discretion, whatever they are comfortable with. But I'll tell them, if someone's complete blood count markers are high, you should probably avoid these drugs. But in some cases, I have people that are like, look, this is what I want to do. And if they tell me something like that, then I'll be like, look, if you wanted to do something like that, then let's get you prescribed a low dose of Eliquis, which is a mild anticoagulant. And I'll tell you right now, if some of the people that I know that have suffered these cardiovascular issues were on something like this, it could save their lives. But they don't take the time to really fully educate themselves or go and look into this stuff to do that. So I usually will structure someone's gear protocol. First thing I'll look at is like their labs, their blood work. let's say like if their like complete blood count markers were not high, and health wise they were in a very good ideal spot. Then usually like I would start off like the way that you would do someone's cycle. Let's say if it was not a top pro, but someone that has a potential to get a pro card. I would usually go ahead and start the cycle off with their testosterone at a baseline. And it depends on what they were previously doing. Let's say their testosterone started off the first weeks 1 through 3 at 350 milligrams of test. I would also usually front load it with some sort of an oral just for the first 4 weeks, because usually any sort of injectable, whether it's a long ester or short ester, before it truly peaks in the bloodstream, it's going to usually be at least 4 weeks. So usually would front with like an oral, which there's all different ones that you can go with that are effective. Like if it was a Tyranobol or a D-ball, whatever it may be, like an oral to front load the first 4 weeks, and then add in one other compound. Let's say if it was equipoise or if it was Primabol, and say start that at like around 400 milligrams, and then after the first 3 to 4 weeks, assess that person, how they are responding. And then let's say after the first 4.5 weeks, they've removed the oral out. From there, you could slowly start walking the dosage of some of the injectables up based on how that person is responding. And sometimes if you remove the oral, depending on how that person's feeling, you could potentially, if you wanted to add in a low dose of another compound, you can do that too as well. And then you could slowly walk the dosage up and then just pretty monitor things off a week to week base.
Okay, great. Next question is, what about the GH in off season? Just because, GH, because recently there's a tendency to talk about thickening of the skin just from the buildup of the GH. Do you believe in that? This is the first question. And how much GH do you think it's a good range for a open and /212 bodybuilder in the off season?
So, I mean, it again depends on the individual, but I will tell you one thing. I've seen people that take GH every single day of the week, and also people that will do GH, say 2 days on, 1 day off. And from a results standpoint, you will see just as good results doing it, say 2 days on, 1 day off, or every other day than you would by taking it every day. I think I sent you actually
of course.
Data.
Yeah, of course.
On it. And I've done that. I've seen this done in so many different cases both ways. So with GH, the same thing, depending on what the person was doing previously, would start them off on a baseline dose. If they're doing anything under 4 IUs, it doesn't make sense to split it up if they're doing under 4 IUs. So if they were started off at 3.5 IUs, I would have them usually just take it in the morning and then slowly scale it up. Now, if someone's taking more than, let's say more than 7.5 or 8 IUs, that's when I usually would like to split the time frames up since the time that it peaks in the bloodstream is kind of, that window is a little short. It makes sense to split it up if you're doing higher amounts of it. So let's say if someone was, let's just say, doing 8 units a day, doing it ideally, let's say in the morning, and then sometime around your training, if it's later on in the day. And then some people will do it at night. And the thing is, with doing it at night, yes, that is technically one of a beneficial time to do it, but you're having a natural spike of growth factor and IGF at night. So I usually would like to do it if they're taking it 3 times throughout the day, would do it maybe about 85 minutes before their last meal at night. And listen, if the person's an elite pro, where I think I have about 4 clients where pro bodybuilders for a living. This is all they do. So if I'm doing programming for someone like that, the way that I program their stuff is going to be a little different because it will be much more detailed because look, this is your full-time job.
Yeah.
Like, so if it's going to make 0.5% difference, we're gonna do it then because this is what you're getting paid to do. So, you know, if it requires a little more work, so what? It's your full-time job. So in people's cases like that, the protocol will be a little more detailed in terms of. So what I was saying is sometimes on the days that they don't use GH, sometimes that we would incorporate different types of peptides on those days if it's a particular type of competitor like that.
Yeah, of course. For you telling that you're not so much like to put it at night, but I know that Phil Viss is actually doing it in the middle of the night. So he is actually told his guys to drink some water before go to sleep, just to naturally wake up in the middle of the night and pin that way. I am not gonna asking you about what do you think about it, just because this is
so synergistically.
Yeah,
it does. It makes sense. I tell you, it does. But let's be real. When you've been doing this for a while, I'll tell you something. I can count probably on under probably 15 people that would realistically be able to consistently adhere to something like that. Okay. And trust me, if someone wanted to get really technical, and I've lost clients like this before in the past because they're like, dude, like, I'm seeing great results with your stuff, but it's extremely hard to follow. You know, which I get that because when you build someone a plan, it's something that they can realistically be consistent with and also that they can enjoy, because bodybuilding is a marathon, not a sprint. And at the end of the day, the person that's going to make the most progress is whoever can consistently do this longer.
yeah.
And synergistically, that is great. Yeah, doing it in the middle of the night, that would make a lot of sense. But let's see how many people are realistically going to do that for 2 years straight.
Yeah, this is tough for some people, definitely, especially that you are not sure if you're actually going to wake up. This is not in your willpower. So unless you're setting up the alarm clock, but this is not the best for your sleep, I think. So I will definitely rather to go to sleep, and the GH at night is probably a little bit better for those who are 30 plus than for the younger individual.
Yes.
The last question is going to be about the insulin in off-season. Your opinion about utilizing insulin and what kind of insulin you prefer. Is going to be a short-acting or long-acting one? And if it's going to be a long-acting, when and why?
So great question. So again, this really boils down to individual. Yes, there are a lot of cases where we do use insulin and it's very beneficial. It is. I think, you know, testosterone, growth hormone, and insulin are probably your bread and butter things that are going to really put on the most quality tissue at the end of the day. Now, if you have someone, let's say, like Humalog, obviously, hands down is the best to go around your workouts, without a doubt. Now, people that do have a very fast metabolism and naturally are a skinnier person by nature, some of those people would benefit more from a long-acting insulin, like doing either a Lantus saturation protocol, which I've seen people put on the most tissue doing some of the. Now, if you're talking about something like Lantus, most of the time when people do Lantus, they take it and they don't take nearly enough of it to grow. Because I'll be honest, to actually take enough of it to grow, you have to take a good amount of it. Because anything usually, the doses that most people are taking it at are literally maintenance doses to just help your body be insulin sensitive from the amount of growth hormone that you're using. It's not actually benefiting them so much in terms of putting muscle tissue on. It's just preventing them. It's giving their pancreas a break with the amount of growth hormone that they're taking. If they're doing truly a saturation protocol, and when you're talking about Lantus, you can't do it every single day because, again, you'd see great results for 2 weeks and then you just accumulate a ton of shit weight, water, and body fat. You would do it typically on your saturation-based days, which usually those are weaker muscle group days, larger muscle groups, and you would split it up, doing it in the morning and at night. And because Lantus is so long acting, you don't have to worry about going hypoglycemic like you would with Humalog or something like that. And then, a Lantus saturation protocol, you would taper it up every week until, there's some saturation protocols that get over, 165, 180 IUs of it a day. But in times, that's how much you would need to do of it to truly grow. And on those days, that's when it becomes a little more safer for you to ramp up your growth hormone a little bit higher. But let's say it's an average person that does accumulate body fat a little more easily. Doing the Humalog around the workouts, whether it's before or after, I personally think, some people's cases, I have them do it pre and post workout, but bang for like buck wise, the most important time to really be shuttling nutrients into the muscle is going to be your post workout. And if you time Humalog correctly, it peaks twice. And when I say peak twice, what I mean by that is, let's say if you're training, okay, you get done with your workout, you take your, whatever it is, 8 or 10 IUs of Humalog, usually it'll peak 20 minutes later. And when I say peak, I mean driving your blood sugar down, because the reason why insulin works so well for growth is because if we're eating throughout the day and let's say our blood sugar is 140 and you're eating, your body is not really partitioning that nutrients into the muscle. Now, if you drive your blood sugar down below whatever it is, 90, 85, and then you eat, the body is soaking up that nutrients. So after a workout, if you do the Humalog correctly, it peaks twice. So you would take it after the workout, say 20 minutes later, it drives your blood sugar down. You have a post-workout shake with whatever it is, 100 grams of carbohydrates. Then a good question I get asked all the time, a lot of people ask me, when should I eat my post-workout meal? Now on their plan, I'll put a basic average time frame, but the actual scientific answer to that question is, because that can range totally different on the person, it's really however long it takes for your blood sugar to get pushed back down. That's how long you should wait to eat that meal. And then if you time the insulin right, it'll peak again after the post-workout shake. Typically a person that's fairly, I would say maybe an hour later, it'll drive the blood sugar down again. And that's when you would hit your post-workout meal. That's typically, I would say, the best ways to incorporate insulin. And for like a regular person that you're pushing pretty hard in the off season, trying to pack on as much tissue, in the middle of the day, sometimes you could benefit maybe from like a Humulin R, like a 10 or 12 hour half-life insulin. Like let's say if you're training between meals 4 and 5, taking like maybe 10 units or 12 units of Humulin R before your second meal of the day, and then doing the Humalog post-workout. That's something that's very effective too. But again, it really boils down to the person.
Yeah, of course. So just for those who are never used the insulin, do not try to fit into your program right now just because Dom says it's going to be a great one. Remember, start slowly, and probably the best way to start with the insulin is 3 to 5 IUs after the training, not before, just because you are probably not even notice when the hypo is gonna hit you, and you're probably just gonna think that you are dizzy just from the set. So have it in the back of your mind that this is insulin is, in my opinion, one of the safest drug in the bodybuilding.
I agree
if you have something called brain.
Yep.
If you are have not sufficient amount of brain in your scalp, just do not use it, or just shoot DM to Dom and ask for for help with your off-season comp prep and stuff like that. Just work with someone who knows what he is doing, because it could be dangerous, but only if you are not basically know anything. Because if you are know basics, it's safe.
No, because I mean, I'll tell you the biggest misconception, and you're 100% right. Insulin is probably one of the safest things that you can do. It gets a very bad rep because, unfortunately, this industry breeds a lot of unintelligent people, to say the least. But a lot of times, what people will do, but coaches do need to specify this. If someone says do 8 IUs of Humalog, sometimes people will go on an insulin pen and pull it to 80.
8, yeah. I know that.
You know, I've seen people do that, and that's then you're definitely a recipe for going hypo in a case like that. That's what happens. And also a lot of times when I have people, bodybuilders, non-bodybuilders, people that are in pre-diabetic ranges, I'll tell you one of the best ways to help cure pre-diabetes is by using something like Lantus. Not doing it the way that I suggested with growing. Yeah. But when you take insulin, because people always think, oh, when I take insulin, it's going to shut my natural insulin. No, it's not. It's actually going to help your pancreas, because you're giving the pancreas a break to allow it to be able to produce insulin on its own. And that's why sometimes, like, to help people that are pre-diabetic, some of the best ways to do it is to use Lantus to give the pancreas a break and then slowly taper them off the Lantus. And that's like one of the best ways a lot of times to do it. But in terms of insulin too, for someone that just started bodybuilding, that's not something I would even think about for at least until you're at an elite level for a few years. And even with people that are an elite level in their off season, they probably wouldn't even be getting anywhere near even doing a mild Humalog protocol until they're at least 8 to 9 weeks into their off season, at least, because everything else, all the androgens are starting to just peak in their bloodstream then. And, when you go into a bodybuilding prep, that's why it is so like exciting and it's interesting, because you have all these different tools that you can use. You have your training, your diet, your cardio, your PEDs, your recovery, and at certain points you manipulate certain things. And one of the biggest mistakes that people will make earlier in their career is they'll just throw everything in right off the bat, and then you're stuck and you're not going to be in a place to really make progress.
Yeah. And coming back to what you say before, this is why I love my insulin, but this is why if I'm using it with my clients, they are not allowed to use syringe. They have to buy the pen. Yeah, just because it's extremely hard for some individuals to count at it from the syringe. So it's just too dangerous.
I agree.
One more question that I have to definitely incorporate here into my notes is, what do you think? When is the best time to use the higher amount of drugs? Off-season or contest prep? Just because I asking this, just because, for example, John Jewett like to say that in the contest prep, you actually do not need to use a lot. Just because you are not building, so you are not need as much as in the off-season, basically. Do you agree?
Yeah, I would say so. It depends, because, like, for an example, when you say off season, for an example, in your rebound phase, like after a show.
No, off season. I think about off season, not the 6 to 8 period like a week's period after the comp, but after that. So let's say you do
say 6 months after you compete.
Yeah, of course. Like the whole time you're just strict building, so you are building up the dose to a certain amount, and that amount should supposedly be the highest amounts during the whole year.
So I would say in terms of your total weekly dosage would probably be the highest, yes, in the off season, as long as the person's health markers are good, their body fat's in a good range. And yes, I would say that that's it. However, I would say when you're in prep, though, you need to use more different compounds from different derivatives, if that makes sense to you. So, you know, like you don't necessarily, like in the off season, like when you're in prep, you would want to use like more, like if you're using a DHT derivative here, you'd want to get the benefit from each derivative, but you can run it at a lower dose when you're in prep. But when you're in off season, you would run a slightly higher amount, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so the off season is more basic. It's like more like a test and anabolic, and that's probably gonna be enough. Sometimes the third compound, but for the really advanced guys or the guys who are not handling the aromatase and those probably could benefits from doing something like DHT derivatives or something like that. But for most of the time, is enough, I think.
But I'll tell you right now, though, when you're at like the 9-week out marker from a show, your gear is not going to be any lower than it is at the peak of your off season. No, like the last 4 weeks in prep, the injectables are pretty much, I think they're kind of irrelevant. The last 4 weeks, the injectables are not that important. Maybe some of your DHT derivatives are a little more important. Your Masteron, the orals are a little bit more important, like your Winstrol, Proviron. Anti-estrogens are a little bit like as you get really closer. And at that point too, I mean, this is probably for a different topic when we're in prep, but a lot of times I've had people that didn't even make it to the Olympia because they were taking too much drugs when they're in prep, and it was preventing them from dropping body fat and responding, and it was also preventing them from getting their skin very thin.
I hope that you are not going to kill me, but one more thing. What do you think about the AI on the off season, and how much you should lower your estrogen? This is one that comes to my mind right now, just because this is something that
it's super important.
Yeah, that was totally different with you.
So, okay, when it comes to AIs, they're the most abused thing that I feel like that is on the planet. And they are responsible for a lot of cardiovascular issues. And not only that, but they also could potentially hinder your progress because you don't want your estrogen to be too low. You need estrogen. And even in terms of like progress and even health, when people sit there and they even look at a blood panel and they say, oh my God, but my estrogen's high. Your estrogen is related to your testosterone. So your estrogen should be 5% of whatever your total testosterone is. So if someone says, oh, you know, they're freaking out, my estrogen is 100 and something. Okay, yeah, that might not be good then if your testosterone was only, 800. Yes, that's a little high then if your testosterone is only that. But if your test levels are 3,500, it's normal for your estrogen to be higher, and it should be about 5% of what your total testosterone is. Now, in terms of
I have one question. This is like a blood readings, yes, not like a 3,500 of injectable testosterone.
If you're saying if your total testosterone was 3,500, or
no, I saying about the blood readings, just because you says 800 testosterone, but you mean on the paper, yes, on the lab, not that you're injected 800. Okay, I wanted to just clear that, just because some guys would gonna be
no
shock.
meaning that on your blood work, and it all has to do with the individual. That's really what it boils down to. How easy does someone like convert? That's really what it would boil down to. Like, and I have some people that, even myself, I don't need to take any sort of aromatase inhibitor like at all. And if I was going to recommend one, like in the off season, typically what I would say for someone that's an elite pro, that they usually can do either, and they are somewhat sensitive, they could usually do either 12.5 to 25 milligrams of an aromasin every other day. That's a little less harsh on your lipid profiles than some of the other ones, or some SERMs. With Novadex works a little bit differently. It blocks at the receptor, opposed to Arimidex stops the conversion of testosterone to estrogen, where Novadex blocks at the receptor, but Novadex also supposedly blunts IGF. So, if you're taking growth hormone and stuff, like Novadex might not be super beneficial, unless you're doing like a post-cycle phase, like, you were taking like HCG and you were coming off, then Novadex would be a better suit. But typically the most that someone should, and this is someone that is very sensitive, the most I would say would be a little bit of aromasin, whether it's 12.5 every other day or 25 every other day, should be good. And then, it depends. If you see that person and they are having, estrogen related side effects, then, kind of reevaluate things. Also, to remember, all compounds don't necessarily convert. Some of them convert to, prolactin. If you're taking a 19-nor compound, a lot of times that will be the problem. And in that case, you would be better off doing like a little bit of Caber, like 0.25 mcgs, like every 3 days is something perfect. And that's pretty much how you would go about it. The only time that you do need to focus on keeping your estrogen a little bit lower to avoid any estrogen related water retention would be like the last 3 weeks going into a show. But that's pretty much it. But when I say a little bit low, that doesn't mean you want to nuke your estrogen, because if you do that, a lot of times, especially with guys that are really big, they can potentially flatten out in certain circumstances if you're just nuking the shit out of your estrogen.
Yeah. Okay, then. Thank you so much for today. I know you have like 1 hour, and we are sitting a little bit more than 1.5 hours right now, so I'm not gonna stealing you more of your time. And I hope you're gonna come back, just because we just touch off season, and we have like a transition into the prep, and then the peak week, and coming out of the prep as well. So if you're gonna have some time in the future, we it's gonna be probably best to just set up the next call and talk a little bit about it.
Why don't we do it next weekend at the same time?
Yeah, for me, it's going to be fine. Okay, so thank you for today. And if someone is here with us after 1.5 hours, just don't forget to subscribe, comment, and share this, especially if you are living outside of Poland, just because, like we touched briefly before we start the podcast with Dom, it's extremely hard to reach the viewers outside of Poland when I am uploading it from Poland. So I will be appreciated very, very much. Don't forget to check everything about the Dom, every like a contact to the Dom you're gonna find in the description box below, as well as contact to myself if you wanted to, I don't know, shoot the shit or something like that.
I'm a coach too. You're a coach too.
Yeah, of course, I am a coach too, but it's like a different level compared to you.
I mean, you probably are better than most out there because you've competed at a pretty elite level. You've seen different cases. And I'll tell you, like, I went to school to be a dietitian, yes, but you learn the most when you physically go through different phases yourself. And even outside of the bodybuilding realm, even like going to school to be a dietitian, I learned a lot because I've tried every diet there is under the sun. And when you actually apply them to yourself, you could relate a lot better and, prescribe these different methods accordingly to the right people.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that, and I totally agree with that. As nothing is as much as important as your own like trial and error. I think this is something that's gonna learn you the most. But okay, Dom, thank you for today. And the last thing I have to say is I'm gonna wish you the best, and you're probably going to the sleep just because it's night where you live.
Yeah,
I'm starting the day and you're finishing it.
Absolutely, I know it's crazy, but yeah, no, I'm gonna get some rest. But no, we'll be in touch. I'll shoot you a message tomorrow, and then I look forward to continuing this next week.
Thank you so much, and see you guys next week then.
Absolutely, brother. Thank you.